The mid-19th century American frontier was a treacherous and unforgiving land, where settlers battled not only the elements, but the looming terror of the Comanche. Known for launching raids under the ominous glow of the Comanche moon, these warriors brought chaos and destruction to the frontier. Entire towns lived in constant fear, knowing that a night of calm could quickly turn into a nightmare. These raids were not random acts of violence. They were deliberate, swift, and deeply rooted in the Comanche's warrior traditions, striking fear into the hearts of settlers who were largely unprepared for their brutality. The Comanche, who emerged from the Shoshone in the 18th century, thrived on movement and the vast plains they called home. The arrival of the horse transformed them into masters of the plains, allowing them to hunt bison with unmatched efficiency and perfect their deadly raiding tactics. By the mid-19th century, as settlers encroached on their land, tensions mounted. The buffalo herds, crucial to the Comanche's survival, dwindled, pushing the tribe into desperate measures to protect their way of life. Raids became not only a means of survival but a fierce defense against the settlers who threatened to erase them from the plains. Cynthia Ann Parker's story became emblematic of the horrors the Comanche could unleash. At just 9 years old, she was taken captive during a brutal raid on Fort Parker. Her uncle, Benjamin Parker, tried to negotiate with the warriors, but was killed. Torn from her family, Cynthia Ann was forced into the Comanche world, where she endured hardship but eventually adapted. Though reunited with her original family years later, the trauma left permanent scars. Her story was just one of many, as countless settlers faced similar terror and uncertainty. Rachel Plummer, another captive, experienced the heart-wrenching loss of her family in a single day, when hundreds of Comanche warriors attacked her Texas settlement. Her husband was killed, and she was taken prisoner, separated from her child, and marched into Comanche territory. Like many others, Rachel's trauma became part of the dark legacy that defined the American frontier. The Comanche's raids weren't driven by cruelty, but by survival. As settlers pushed further into their lands and the buffalo disappeared, the Comanche had little choice but to fight back. Horses, essential to their mobility and independence, became key targets in their raids. Each attack was a calculated effort to reclaim what was theirs, reminding settlers that the plains were still contested ground. The Comanche moon provided a perfect backdrop for their lightning-fast raids, which left settlements in smoldering ruins and shattered lives. The Comanche's strategy was not just about physical warfare, it was psychological. Their sudden, terrifying strikes demoralized entire communities, leaving survivors haunted by the speed and ferocity of the attacks. They used fear as a weapon, and their ability to disappear into the night made them nearly impossible to stop. For the settlers, surviving a Comanche raid was an act of sheer will, as they faced a foe that seemed to defy the very nature of frontier defense. Yet the story of the Comanche is not solely one of destruction. It is also a story of resilience. As the settlers expanded and their world shrank, the Comanche held on, their raids becoming increasingly desperate as their land and resources vanished. They fought not just for survival, but for the preservation of their culture and identity, which was being erased by the relentless tide of settlers. In 1871, the Comanche launched a massive raid on a Texas settlement, a stark reminder of their enduring power. Sarah Miller, one of the survivors, recalled waking to the screams of her neighbors and the sight of their cabin in flames. The Comanche swept through the camp with the force of a storm, and though Sarah managed to escape, many were not as fortunate. These raids, while terrifying, were a last stand for the Comanche, a desperate attempt to hold on to a world that was slipping away. The settlers, though often outnumbered and outmatched, tried to defend themselves, but the vastness of the frontier made it nearly impossible. The Comanche's mobility on horseback gave them an enormous advantage, allowing them to strike where settlers were most vulnerable and vanish before any meaningful defense could be mounted. The slow pace of communication only added to the settlers' difficulties, as news of raids often arrived too late for any military response to be effective. The U.S. military, despite its presence on the frontier, struggled to counter the Comanche's guerrilla tactics. Isolated forts and understaffed outposts were no match for the Comanche's swift and deadly raids. The military, trained in European-style warfare, found it difficult to engage an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. While some military campaigns, like those led by General Ranald S. Mackenzie, managed to weaken the Comanches' power, the conflict dragged on, with violence flaring up repeatedly throughout the 19th century. The legacy of the Comanche raids left a lasting impact on the development of the American West. The constant threat of attack slowed settlement, as many potential settlers hesitated to move into such dangerous territory. Those who did settle often clustered together in fortified communities, seeking safety in numbers. This pattern of settlement, driven by fear of the Comanche, shaped the landscape of the West, with towns growing around military forts and defensive structures. The near extinction of the buffalo, a consequence of both settler overhunting and the Comanches' reliance on the animal, had devastating effects on the Great Plains. Without the buffalo, the Comanches' way of life became unsustainable. As the herds disappeared, so did the balance that had allowed the Comanche to thrive for generations. The land, once teeming with life, was now a shadow of its former self, and the Comanche were left to fight for survival in a world that was rapidly changing. Despite the violence and fear, the Comanche were not simply bloodthirsty warriors. They were a people defending their way of life against overwhelming odds. Their raids were driven by necessity, and their culture was rich with tradition, artistry, and spiritual depth. By understanding the human stories behind the conflict, we gain a more nuanced view of the Comanche, a people caught between survival and annihilation, fighting for their place in a world that was being taken from them. The memory of the Comanche moon still lingers in the history of the American West, a symbol of the fierce warriors who once ruled the plains. Their legacy, though marked by violence, is also one of resilience and defiance. The Comanche were not just raiders, they were a people fighting for their survival, and their story is one of both tragedy and heroism. As the frontier was tamed, the echoes of their hoofbeats faded, but their impact on the history of the West remains, a reminder of the power and perseverance of a people who refused to be forgotten. Frontier settlements were often small and struggling, barely able to feed their own people, let alone supply the soldiers needed to chase down the elusive Comanche. Supplying forts with adequate food, ammunition, and horses was a constant struggle. Imagine trying to fight a war with limited supplies, always wondering if the next meal or round of ammunition would arrive in time. The Comanche weren't interested in conquering land in the traditional sense. Their raids sought horses, plunder, and disruption of settlement life, which made it nearly impossible to achieve a decisive victory against them. Their style of warfare was like trying to extinguish a wildfire that constantly reignited in unpredictable places. Despite the overwhelming challenges, frontier communities devised methods to fortify themselves against these terrifying raids. Blockhouses, sturdy structures built from logs, became central points of defense. Families would rush to these fortified buildings when an attack was imminent, firing rifles through strategically placed loopholes. John Henry Brown, a Texas settler in 1848, often mentioned in his journal the life-saving role that blockhouses played during raids. In addition to these structures, settlers formed local militias composed of able-bodied men who could respond quickly to attacks. Although not professional soldiers, these militia groups provided some form of resistance, although their effectiveness was often hampered by a lack of training and coordination. As Martha Jane Canary, better known as Calamity Jane, wrote in her memoirs, these militias were a crucial, if imperfect, line of defense. Frontier communities also established communication networks to warn neighboring settlements of impending attacks. Signal fires, horn blasts, and other methods gave residents precious seconds to reach the relative safety of blockhouses or hidden locations. James Hobbs, a frontiersman in Missouri, recalled how these early warning systems allowed his community to prepare for a Comanche attack, saving lives. Ranchers also began constructing fortified homes with high walls, lookout towers, and strategically placed rifle ports. Places like St. Mary's Ranch in Texas became well known for offering protection to settlers and their livestock. Some frontier families even sought alliances with more peaceful tribes like the Pawnee or Wichita, who provided valuable intelligence on Comanche movements. Despite these efforts, complete defense was nearly impossible. The vastness of the frontier, combined with the Comanche's superior mobility and tactics, ensured that they remained a persistent and terrifying threat. But these measures provided at least a semblance of security and fostered a sense of community in the face of constant danger. The U.S. military played a significant role in attempting to curb Comanche raids, but their efforts were fraught with difficulty. Much like the Spanish before them, the U.S. forces found themselves stretched thin across an enormous expanse of land. The network of forts established along the frontier served as outposts for patrols and, theoretically, deterrents against raids. However, these forts were often understaffed and isolated, limiting their effectiveness. The Comanches' hit-and-run tactics made them impossible to engage in decisive battles. U.S. troops, trained in European-style warfare, were ill-prepared to counter the guerrilla tactics employed by the Comanche. Supplying these remote forts with food, ammunition, and horses proved an expensive and logistically complex task. Furthermore, the policies of forced removal and broken treaties with the Comanche only fueled further conflict. Unlike the Spanish, who occasionally sought alliances with other tribes, the U.S. approach often created tensions that exacerbated hostilities. Still, military campaigns, particularly those led by General Ranald S. Mackenzie, eventually weakened the Comanches' power, forcing them onto reservations. However, these victories were often temporary, with renewed outbreaks of violence occurring throughout the 19th century. The Comanche raids left a lasting impact on the development of the American West. The constant threat of attack deterred many settlers from venturing into the frontier, slowing the region's development. Imagine a farmer hesitating to plant crops, knowing that a raid could destroy everything overnight. Settlers who did brave the frontier often clustered together for safety, forming fortified communities rather than spreading out into isolated homesteads. This pattern of settlement contrasted sharply with the more dispersed development seen in other parts of the country. The need to address the Comanche threat also led to an increased military presence on the frontier, which in turn shaped the growth of towns like Dodge City, Kansas. Towns that sprang up to serve the soldiers and supply the forts. But the conflict between settlers and the Comanche also fueled tensions between Native American tribes and white settlers, making peaceful coexistence difficult and hindering diplomatic efforts. These tensions, combined with the environmental devastation caused by the overhunting of bison, contributed to a landscape forever changed by war. The legacy of the Comanche raids endures as a reminder of the brutal, complex, and often misunderstood conflict that defined the American frontier. Their hit-and-run tactics, mastery of the horse, and fierce warrior culture left an indelible mark on the history of the West. For the settlers who survived these raids, their stories are ones of resilience, terror, and above all, survival in the face of overwhelming odds. The frontier may have been tamed, but the memory of the Comanche moon still casts a long shadow over the plains, a reminder of the power and fury of a people fighting for their way of life. The near extinction of the buffalo herds, a devastating consequence of both Comanche raids and overhunting by settlers, had a profound impact on the entire Great Plains ecosystem. Picture a vast grassland, once teeming with life, now stripped of its dominant grazers. This loss caused an ecological imbalance that rippled across the landscape, altering the delicate balance that had sustained the region for centuries. Yet, even amid the violence of raids and the bitter conflict, there was some cultural exchange between the settlers and the Comanche. Captives like Cynthia Ann Parker, a white girl taken in a Comanche raid, were absorbed into the life of the tribe, blurring the lines between cultures. Her story, as well as that of her son, Quanah Parker, a famous Comanche leader, became emblematic of the complicated and often contradictory relationship between the two sides. The Comanche raids, however, were not just about stealing cattle and horses. These attacks were a significant factor in shaping the course of westward expansion, slowing development, influencing settlement patterns, and leaving behind a legacy of distrust that would echo for generations. Early accounts by settlers often painted the Comanche as savage warriors, bloodthirsty and relentless, driven by a desire for violence and plunder. This portrayal, born out of fear and misunderstanding, dominated much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In popular culture, particularly in Western movies, the Comanche were often reduced to one-dimensional villains, perpetuating stereotypes that persisted for decades. However, in recent years, Historians and anthropologists have worked to challenge these simplistic views. Delving deeper into the Comanche way of life, they have uncovered a complex and rich culture defined by more than just warfare. The Comanche were indeed formidable warriors, but they were also skilled horsemen, artists, and spiritual people. Their social structures were intricate, their traditions rich, and their ability to adapt to the harsh realities of the Great Plains was nothing short of remarkable. Works like Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynne have shed light on the human stories behind the conflict, particularly through figures like Cynthia Ann Parker and Quanah Parker. These narratives provide a more balanced perspective, showcasing the complexities on both sides of the frontier struggle. Despite this progress in understanding, stereotypical portrayals of the savage Indian continue to persist in some areas of popular media. To fully grasp the historical context of the Comanche Wars, it is crucial to recognize that the Comanche were not merely aggressors. They were defending their land, their resources, and their way of life from the encroaching settlers. Understanding their motivations allows us to see the conflict from both sides, moving beyond reductive labels to appreciate the deeper human struggle at play. Shifting perceptions of the Comanche reflect a broader effort to challenge simplistic historical narratives. By acknowledging the richness of their culture, the historical context of their resistance, and the personal stories of those involved, we gain a more nuanced understanding of this remarkable tribe. Remembering the Comanche Wars isn't about glorifying violence or demonizing any one side. Instead, it is about understanding the human experiences and struggles that shaped the American West. Examining the causes of the Comanche Wars, competition for resources, cultural misunderstandings, and the pressures of westward expansion, offers valuable lessons for how we might approach conflicts today. By reflecting on the broken treaties between the U.S. government and the Comanche, we are reminded of the importance of honoring agreements and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. These historical failures can guide us toward building more trustworthy and respectful relationships in the future. Moreover, remembering the Comanche people ensures that their rich cultural traditions, artistic expressions, and incredible adaptability to the harsh environment of the Great Plains are not lost to history. Their story adds depth to the American narrative, reminding us of the diversity of human experience and the ingenuity of those who thrived in challenging circumstances. The Comanche Wars are an integral part of American history, and by remembering this period, we confront the complexities of our past. It allows us to create a more inclusive narrative, one that acknowledges the experiences of both settlers and the indigenous peoples who shaped the West. The past may not always be comfortable to examine, but it offers invaluable knowledge. By studying it honestly, we gain insight into human resilience, conflict resolution, and the importance of empathy in understanding history's many sides. The harrowing tales of survivors like Mary Morris and John Johnson underscore not just the violence of the raids, but the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Mary, hiding in terror as Comanche warriors swept through her community, survived by sheer will. John, who witnessed the massacre of his family, somehow found the strength to carry on. Their stories, along with the captivity narratives of Elnora and William, reveal the depth of human perseverance. Elnora, torn from her family, endured unimaginable hardship, but found a way to survive by learning the Comanche language and adapting to her new life. William, too, demonstrated remarkable fortitude, becoming a skilled hunter and gaining the respect of his captors. Beyond the immediate terror of the raids, frontier communities faced broader challenges. The vast distances and the Comanche's unparalleled mobility made defense an ongoing nightmare. Settlers built blockhouses, formed militias, and developed communication networks in a desperate attempt to protect themselves. Blockhouses, often constructed from logs and featuring rifle slits, became vital defensive structures. Families would retreat to these fortified buildings during an attack, offering at least some protection against the onslaught. John Henry Brown, a Texas settler, documented the importance of these structures in his journal, noting how they provided a lifeline to frontier families. Despite these efforts, the U.S. military struggled to counter the Comanche threat effectively. Logistical issues, limited manpower, and a lack of understanding of Comanche tactics made it nearly impossible to mount a decisive defense. Forts were established along the frontier, serving as outposts for soldiers tasked with patrolling the region. However, these forts were often isolated and understaffed, making them vulnerable to attack. The Comanches' hit-and-run tactics, combined with their superior horsemanship, rendered conventional military strategies ineffective. The frustration felt by U.S. troops mirrored that of the Spanish, who had faced similar difficulties during their conflicts with the Comanche centuries earlier. The long-term consequences of the Comanche raids were profound. Settlement of the West slowed as many potential settlers hesitated to move into such a dangerous and unpredictable region. Those who did venture west often clustered together in fortified communities, a pattern of settlement that stood in stark contrast to the more dispersed development seen in other parts of the country. The constant need for protection shaped the landscape, with towns growing around military forts, like Dodge City in Kansas, which catered to soldiers and frontier defense. Perhaps the most tragic outcome of the Comanche Wars was the near extinction of the buffalo herds, which had sustained the Great Plains for generations. As settlers and Comanche alike hunted these animals, the delicate ecological balance of the region was shattered. Without the buffalo, the plains became a different, less vibrant place, and the loss had devastating consequences for the tribes that had relied on the herds for their survival. Moving beyond simplistic stereotypes of the Comanche as bloodthirsty warriors allows us to appreciate the complexities of the conflict. The Comanche were a people defending their way of life, their land, and their culture against overwhelming odds. Their resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity are as much a part of their story as the violence of the raids. By remembering the human cost of the Comanche Wars, on both sides, we gain empathy and valuable lessons about conflict resolution, the importance of diplomacy, and the need to honor treaties. Ultimately, acknowledging the overlooked experiences of those who lived through the Comanche raids provides a more complete understanding of the American West. It allows us to see history not in black and white terms, but in the full complexity of human experience, with all its triumphs, tragedies, and lessons for the future.